the presentations yesterday were so good. I'm a little worried about being a disappointment in comparison. It was a hard act to follow, but we'll see. I want to thank the organizers for bringing us all together. For me, it's like a reunion party mainly, but also I want to thank them for asking me to speak about so-called multi-generational mobility. They didn't exactly have to twist my arm. I enthusiastically said yes. We've been using the expression intergenerational mobility to talk about the association and socioeconomic status between adjacent generations. Multi-generational mobility is the rubric increasingly used to refer to the association of socioeconomic status across 3 or more generations. I thought I'd start by juxtaposing 2 quotations, and the first where it's very appropriate in this time and place to be quoting Gary Becker. This particular quotation's from his very influential 1986 Joly paper with Nigel Tomes, and it says, practically all the advantages or disadvantages of ancestors tend to disappear in only 3 generations, from shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. Parents in such open societies have little effect on the earnings of grandchildren and later descendants. Now I want to juxtapose against that this other quotation from my old friend Greg Clark from his recent and much publicized book, The Sun, S-O-N, also rises. In that book, as many of you know, they're grouping observations within generations by surname, and their bottom line is surname status shows regression to the mean in all cases, but the process is slow. Elite surnames can take 10 or 15 generations, 300 to 450 years, to become average in status. So I like to kind of put both of those quotations up together with 2 lessons to draw. One is they're directly contradicting each other about as much as possible in terms of how much multi-generational mobility there is, which obviously poses an empirical question. Who's right, or is the truth somewhere in between, or does it vary? So we'll be talking about that. But the other takeaway is the common ground, which is they both consider it an interesting question. They're both speaking with great interest to the question of how much multi-generational mobility is there. And with this audience, I don't think I have to argue too strenuously for the importance of the question. Basically, there's much discussed yesterday, all would care about intergenerational mobility. Well, if you care about the correlation between 2 adjacent the same reasons, including concerns about equality of opportunity, would apply to 3 or more generations as well.
I mean, they are in principle compatible in a certain sense. And what I mean is
what's compatible?
The 2 statements, since that's about kind of an average, and whereas Greg's talking about tails. And so to make the extreme example would be the elite last name associated being the monarch of the United Kingdom hasn't changed for a very long time.
Oh, yeah, but you know what? In a way, maybe this wasn't the best quotation to pick.
Okay, then go ahead.
As you will see, Greg and his collaborators are arguing that it's not just the tails, that it's like a universal law of humankind that
I'm willing to quarrel about that, but you should go ahead.
We'll come back to it. So here's the plan organizationally. First, I'll give an overview of the surprisingly large and long-running literature on multi-generational mobility from an empirical standpoint. Then, perhaps uncharacteristically for me, we're going to do some theory, which will be important for interpreting the evidence and for guiding us towards what other evidence we should be gathering. And then, because I find Clark's work so fascinating and provocative, I'll kind of give it special attention. After talking about other theoretical interpretations, I'll focus specifically on his, which connects some with the other ones, but is also distinct in some ways. So, of course, many of us in this room have been devoting a lot of our effort to estimating intergenerational mobility by estimating first-order autoregressions, regressions of offspring's log income, for example, on parental log income. So the first question I want to put out there is the process really AR1? Now, before going further into that, I want to note that for the purposes for which we've been running these intergenerational regressions, for that purpose, it's actually an ill-posed question. We're not usually in these intergenerational regressions claiming to be estimating a data generating process. Rather, we're trying to get a descriptive statistic that answers the question we find interesting of, well, how much connection is there between the offspring's socioeconomic status and that of the parents? And for that purpose, it's a reasonable thing to estimate the linear projection of one on the other and see what the slope coefficient turns out to be. But what if instead we want to extrapolate from our two-generation results how the associations die out over additional generations? Now, really, it's sort of a fallacy that writers have occasionally, and an example is my old friend George Borjas in his undergraduate labor textbook, have implicitly, if not explicitly, assumed both stationarity of the process and an AR1 data generating process by assuming that whatever the intergenerational autocorrelation was estimated to be, then it dies out at a geometric rate in subsequent generations. So, for example, that exercise would say if you think in a particular country the intergenerational association is 0.4 at first order, then for the second order autocorrelation, that is the correlation between the offspring and the grandparents, you simply square 0.4 and impute 0.16 as the answer. And for the third order autocorrelation, the correlation between the offspring and the great-grandparents, you multiply by 0.4 again to get 0.064. Well, that's pretty arbitrary and not necessarily right. When we get to the theory, we'll see there's no theoretical presumption that the process would be AR1. But first, what I'd like to do is a quick survey of the empirical evidence, okay? And I'm not going to be encyclopedic here. I'm sort of giving examples. And I guess I'm kind of open to suggestion on how encyclopedic to be in the paper later on. So I'm going to start with the University of Chicago example, which sort of illustrates how far back the multi-generational evidence goes. It's not that uncommon for me to see someone new to the field saying, oh, we've been doing all this intergenerational work, and it's only very recently that anyone has gotten multi-generational evidence. Well, we've had it for at least more than 40 years, and I'm not sure this is the first study either. Does anybody know anything about Donald Hodge? I believe he was a sociologist.
He and Bogue were demographers here in Chicago years ago.
All I could find online was that apparently he spent much of his subsequent career at the University of Southern California. But
well, that happens because of the winter.
Yeah, I can relate. I totally relate.
Life cycle phenomenon.
Yeah, okay, so he was at University of Chicago for a long time.
He was here in the 50s and 60s, I
yeah.
believe.
Well, anyway, he was definitely there in the 60s because that's the university that's under his name in this article in Demography. Is entitled Occupational Mobility as a Probability Process. As sociologists often do, and sometimes economists, such as Joe Ferry and Jason Long in new work, he focused on occupational categories across 3 generations. And the whole purpose of the paper was to look at essentially to test the assumption that it was a first-order Markov process. So the question is, in predicting the occupational categories of the son, once you condition on the occupational categories of the father, is there any additional predictive power from the occupational category of the grandfather? And here's the conclusion. Although the discrepancies between the actual and expected values shown in Table 1 clearly indicate the grandfather's occupation bears some relation to grandson's occupation, which is not fully explained by father's occupation, we must emphasize that the discrepancies are not large. Grandfather's occupation does not have any appreciable direct effect upon a person's occupation beyond the indirect effect induced by its influence upon father's occupation. So, in other words, well, it's not exactly AR1. Why would it be? AR1 is probably not the best way to put it when it's categorical, but it's not exactly first-order Markov. but he found that the deviations were not quantitatively large. That's actually probably not such a bad description of the central tendency of the diverse findings in the subsequent literature. And let me go on to those. Speaking to an audience of economists, I'll now talk about the part of the subsequent literature that focuses on the variables we tend to work with, years of education and income variables. And I'll give some examples of results from that literature. Probably many of you know about the Behrman and Taubman 1985 restat paper, which was one of the earlier empirical studies by economists looking at intergenerational mobility. And it used their NAS NRC twins data for the United States. What you might not remember, although you probably read it sometime in the past, is that there's a whole section of the paper devoted to the second order autoregression that throws in the grandparent status as well, for which they had information on years of education. And what motivated them is what you'll see when we get to the theory part of the talk, which is Becker and Holmes actually predicted the process would be AR2 with a negative coefficient for grandparental status for reasons we'll get to later. So Behrman and Taubman were very interested in testing that proposition. And what they found was that the estimated coefficients of grandparental schooling were close to zero and statistically insignificant. And Jerry and Paul described that as a rejection of the Becker-Holmes prediction, which was really too strong because, as you'll see when we get to the theory, the Becker-Holmes prediction is of a small negative coefficient on grandparental status, which wouldn't actually have been detectable with the sample sizes that Behrman and Taubman had, even if it was the right prediction. But it turns out that empirically, this is a fairly common result. In the many studies that have been out there with data on at least 3 generations, they often find small and statistically insignificant coefficient estimates for the grandparental variable. A few examples I've listed here are Liz Peters' 1992 restat paper, which until recently I'd forgotten had any regressions that included grandparents, but it turns out it does. A 1997 American Sociological Review paper by the sociologists Rob Warren and Bob Hauser, which is very focused on estimating multi-generational processes. They were using the Wisconsin longitudinal data. And a new study in the Journal of Population Economics last year by the other Robert Lucas with Kerr using Finnish data. And once again, in that case, they're using income variables and are getting pretty much zilch for the grandparental coefficient. So this is a result that shows up often in the literature, but not always. On the other hand, some other studies estimating multi-generational regressions have gotten non-trivially positive coefficient estimates for grandparental status. And Joe Ferry's getting that in work with historical data on occupational categories for Great Britain and the United States. The example I've got on the slide is a forthcoming JHR paper by Mikael Lindahl and his colleagues. They use 3-generation data from Malmö, Sweden, to estimate regressions of offspring's years of education on parental and grandparental education. The parental coefficient estimate is 0.26, and the grandparental one is 0.06 with a t-statistic of 3. So they've got some action from the grandparental variable in a positive direction. For reasons I don't understand, even though they have log earnings data, they don't report the analogous regression for log earnings. They do report 2 bivariate regressions, the regression of offspring log earnings on parents' log earnings, where they get a coefficient of 0.30, and then they do the regression of offspring log earnings on grandparents' log earnings without including parents' log earnings and get an estimate of 0.18. The fact that the latter is more than the square of the former is suggestive that if they had reported the AR2 regression, they would have gotten a positive coefficient for grandparents' log earnings as they did for grandparents' schooling. What we don't know is what the t-statistic would have been. I don't know. Had I been a referee on that, I would have said that needs to be in their table. But we do at least have the hint from what is reported that the grandparental coefficient would have been positive. I want to mention that a very good fourth-year Michigan State PhD student named Kelly Vosters is writing a dissertation in large part about intergenerational or multi-generational mobility. And in one of the chapters she's just started, she runs similar regressions with PSID data for earnings and income variables. And from the very preliminary results I've seen so far, they look kind of like the Lindahl et al. Results. She is getting significant positive coefficients for the grandparents. Okay, so to summarize so far, some studies haven't found much evidence of a grandparental effect, and I put that in quotes because I'm not getting to causal interpretations just yet, and some others have. And an interesting study that has some of both is a study published this year in Demography by the sociologists Zhang and Shi, entitled The Effects of Grandparents on Children's Schooling, Evidence from Rural China. So they're doing regressions of offspring education on parental and grandparental education, but the new feature is they interact the grandparental education with whether the grandparents co-resided with the parents and children. And their finding is although the education of non-co-resident and deceased grandparents has little or no effect on grandchildren's dropout rate, the effect of co-residence grandparents' education is quite large. These results suggest that grandparents can play an important role in their grandchildren's schooling if they all live under the same roof. It's a pretty interesting result, and of course I'm sure we could get creative and think of alternative interpretations involving selection, but it's wherever it's coming from, it's interesting, and I claim that there are two broader lessons. One is we shouldn't be thinking that that there is one universal grandparental coefficient that applies in all times and places and circumstances. It makes sense to think that, well, it could depend. It could depend on what's going on in the particular situation. And beyond that, as suggested by their causal interpretation, whatever variation we find across circumstances might give us clues for understanding what the underlying causal pathways are. And that's my segue to the theory section, where we start talking about, well, given this evidence, what's actually going on? What does it mean?
So no one found a negative coefficient?
No, it's almost unheard of to get a significant negative coefficient estimate. And I'll come back to interpreting that. And,
I thought Holmes and Becker reported that in one of their papers. I'm not sure though.
Well,
I thought they showed some evidence. It's just selective memory, maybe.
Yeah, well, in the 86 Jolie paper, when they survey evidence, they do.
They report something.
There's a version in Jennifer Wall's dissertation about wealth.
Yeah.
There was some odd version of the regression involving some IV estimate that didn't make a lot of sense to me, where she managed to get a significant negative coefficient estimate.
Right.
But it's kind of an outlier result. I mean, of course, we run enough regressions on this. Somebody's going to find that. But it's very unusual to get that result. I probably shouldn't have said nobody gets it, but it's very unusual, and I haven't seen a case of a compellingly negative coefficient estimate. Doesn't mean it couldn't happen, though. Because I think we'll get to it soon, but there is a logic to the Becker and Holmes prediction. I think what's going on in the data is there are other things going on as well.
Does the lack of a negative coefficient argue against Goldberger's critique of Becker-Holmes? Because he was arguing got basically the same model. It was like a distributed lag model with a first-order serial correlation in the errors, and you produced, I think, a negative coefficient if serial correlations were positive and lambdas were positive. So
yeah.
I'm just wondering if you could recast it slightly, right? I mean, as I recall, right? Wasn't that the prediction? So Goldberg was saying you basically got the same thing out of a pure statistical model.
Yeah.
And
well,
that he would have had the prediction, I think, of the negative.
Under certain assumptions. That's what I'm about to get to,
okay.
is to kind of write down those models.
Yeah. So, okay. No, but his was just a purely statistical model, and claiming, so this is evidence against the kind of Goldberger critique too, indirectly, I guess.
Yeah, well, we'll talk about that soon.
Yeah.
Okay, so for me, the convenient point of departure is the initial version my variation on the Becker and Holmes model that I wrote up in issue of the Sociology Journal that was devoted to multi-generational inequality. But I don't want to claim much originality for my model. It's really just a tweaking of the Becker and Holmes 1979 model that where my original motivation for doing the tweaking was I wanted to see if I could mess with the assumptions in a way that would justify the double log functional form that we were talking about all day yesterday for intergenerational mobility regressions. And it turned out there was a way to contrive that. So that's the model I've been working with, and lately have been able to put it to work on other questions, including multi-generational mobility. So the assumptions are spelled out in the paper, but here are the main things. And a lot of this showed up in the discussion yesterday too. The model, a single parent divides her income between not exactly her own consumption, but the consumption of the family in the generation in which she's a parent, and investment in a single child's human capital so as to maximize the same Cobb-Douglas utility function that was up here several times yesterday, in which the two goods are the parent's consumption and the child's adult income. I tweaked the functional form assumptions for the human capital production function and the earnings function in such a way that the elasticity of the child's adult income with respect to parental investment in the child's human capital would be a constant elasticity gamma. And that notation is going to keep showing up here, so I need you to remember what gamma is. We can loosely call it the earnings return to human capital investment expressed in elasticity form. And the human capital production function, which we saw yesterday also, includes an E term that denotes the human capital endowment the child receives regardless of the family's conscious investment choices. And that endowment is expected to be intergenerationally correlated because of both inheritance of genetic traits and cultural inheritance, an example of which is the effects of parental role modeling. And initially, we'll change this up later, but initially I'll follow Becker and Holmes in assuming that the endowment inheritance process is AR1 with an autoregressive parameter of lambda, which we might call the heritability coefficient. Okay, so I think Jim was talking about this yesterday in the discussion in the papers, that there are two things going on that lead to intergenerational transmission. One is the richer parents have the wherewithal to invest more in their kids' human capital. The other is that there's this genetic and cultural inheritance process. And
I guess what Jim was trying to get at, which I think is quite interesting, is what do you assume about the V? I mean, we know from a labor income process literature that the measurement error tends to be correlated over time. Suppose that's also the case here.
Oh, well, by it, well...
Suppose it's AR1. Suppose the measurement error is AR1.
Oh, then you row difference it and turn this into an AR2.
No, but then you can get any sign of the bias. I mean, then the question becomes, is the measurement error more persistent than income?
Yeah.
So then you can get upward bias, downward bias, I mean, anything.
Well, we will talk about effects of measurement error, but beyond that, but I think what Becker and Holmes had in mind is just literally, this is a stochastic process, and there's just luck of the draw in which genes you get, for example, and that's what it's about.
Well, I understand. I mean, earlier, I think it's interesting in relation to what you said earlier about different, when we look at different outcomes, we get different degree of persistence. One interpretation is that's really true. Another interpretation is that that's just coming from measurement error.
Yeah, I'll be talking about the measurement error will be one of the interpretations I'll get to soon. You know, and I think it's important. I think it really does matter. I agree with you. Before getting to that, a bunch of math from that model leads to this result for beta as the steady state intergenerational income elasticity. It depends positively on both the gamma parameter, which is the return to human capital investment parameter, and the lambda parameter, which is the heritability coefficient. And although Goldberger criticized the Becker and Holmes, I mean, as soon as you look at it, you see there's an identification challenge here. How would you ever tell the difference between the two of them if they enter symmetrically? Well, that's true. I actually view that as a virtue of the Becker and Holmes model, that it's general enough to reveal that there are multiple processes at work. And I think an important lesson is it is hard to tell them apart. So I like that about the Becker and Holmes setup. So as the slide says, what this emphasizes that the intergenerational income elasticity is positive for both of two reasons. Because richer parents' greater investment in their children's human capital makes their children richer on average, and the bigger gamma is, the more force that has, and because lambda is positive, because richer parents tend to have more favorable endowments, and then there's a tendency for those to be somewhat passed on to their children through genetic and/or cultural inheritance. Suppose, for example, that gamma is 0.3 and lambda is 0.2, or vice versa, since they enter symmetrically, then the first order intergenerational elasticity would be about 0.47. Okay. I bring that because I'm going to be messing with that example some more as we continue with implications. Well, this is supposed to be a multi-generational talk, so what's more apropos is what does the model imply about the second order autoregression, the one that includes the grandparents? And the Becker-Holmes result is that in the second order autoregression, gamma plus lambda is the coefficient on parent status, minus gamma times lambda is the coefficient on grandparent status. You get a positive coefficient for the parents and a probably small negative coefficient for the grandparents. So for example, with one of the parameters being 0.3 and the other 0.2, the coefficient on parents would be 0.50, the coefficient for grandparents would be negative 0.06. Now, the first time people see that, it kind of weirds them out because they say, what? It makes you worse off if your grandparents had more money, which is not really what it means. It reflects a subtle implication of higher grandparental income conditional on the amount of parental income. If the parent didn't earn more than he or she did, despite the advantages of higher grandparental income, that signals that the parent got a poor draw on his endowment, and then because of the AR1 process for the endowment, that poor draw tends to be passed on to some extent to the child. So that's the somewhat complex interpretation of the negative coefficient. It's not a causal effect of an exogenous shift in grandparental income. Okay, now if the process really were AR2 with a negative coefficient for grandparental status, then another way of looking at the empirical implications of that is the intergenerational autocorrelations would decline more rapidly than geometrically. So for example, with 0.3 as one of the Greek letters and 0.2 as the other, besides having a 0.47 first order autocorrelation, the second order one would be 0.108, which is to say less than the square of 0.47, and the third order one would be only 0.06. Now, that actually resolved for me a mystery of why did Becker and Holmes make that statement about shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations when their review of the empirical evidence on income and earnings, and wealth was different, they had those results from Jennifer Wall, but the evidence they were surveying on income and earnings was entirely 2-generational evidence. So there's this puzzle of why do they think they even know anything about 3 generations when they didn't refer to any evidence? And it actually makes sense based on 2 premises. First of all, the review of the 2-generation evidence said that famously said at this point, that the intergenerational correlation for adjacent generations is no more than 0.2. And then, B, they had a theory that said the autocorrelations would decline more rapidly than at a geometric rate. So, squaring that would actually have been conservative, given an upper bound for their purposes. Well, thanks to 30 years of additional work on this subject since then, we know that there are actually problems with both premises. Lots of us have spent a lot of time saying, well, 0.2 was described as an upper bound, was considerably downward biased by various measurement problems, including unrepresentative samples and measurement error issues. And now we've also discussed multi-generational evidence that suggests that intergenerational correlations do not seem to die out more rapidly than geometrically, and at least in sometimes in places appear to be dying out less rapidly than geometrically. So we kind of hinted at this a few minutes ago. My feeling about that is not that the Becker and Holmes analysis, or extrapolations of it like mine, are wrong as far as they go. They make sense as far as they go, but they must be leaving something out. There's something else going on that at least sometimes is generating a positive grandparental coefficient, or equivalently slower than geometric decay in the autocorrelations. So that points towards extending the theory, not throwing it out the window as just totally wrong or anything like that. It says there's more going on, as there always is in reality, right? We call them models for a reason. They're models, they're not the reality. So what else could be going on? It turns out some of the fairly obvious and plausible extensions are actually foreshadowed in Becker's writings. So I'm not going to be encyclopedic on this. I have even more examples listed in my sociology journal paper. But let me run by you a few examples in the limited time we have. First, remember that demography article by Zheng and Ji about education over 3 generations in rural China. As they suggested, sometimes the grandparents might really be contributing to cultural inheritance when they're actually, especially if they're present in the family. Turns out that's foreshadowed in Becker's A Treatise on the Family. In chapter 6, he explicitly entertained extending that AR1 endowment transmission model to be more elaborate, to include additional relatives besides the parents. One of the versions of that being a second-order autoregression, where you could throw in the parents' endowment as well, with a presumably positive coefficient, if it kicks in at all, but presumably not as large as the coefficient for the parent status. If you go through all the math over again that led to this second-order autoregression for the kids' log income on the previous 2 generations, with what had been a small negative coefficient for the grandparents, and do it over again with this AR2 model for the endowments, saying, well, maybe the grandparents do have an endowment effect, you end up with this generalization of the model. If lambda 2 is 0, this specializes back to what we had before. But notice 2 things that change if lambda 2 is positive. One is now the great-grandparents kick in with probably a very small negative coefficient. Of course, we could take it still another generation back and undo that, but we won't get into that now. The other thing that's particularly interesting is that with a positive lambda 2, if it's big enough, that could kick the grandparental coefficient into the positive range. Okay, so this is just sort of a formalization of the point that Zheng and Ji were arguing, actually, which is, well, maybe the grandparents do have a direct effect in the endowment process. And people here who know more about genetics than I do could probably make a case for a genetic version of this too, where with recessive genes and all that stuff, that genetic traits could skip a generation. And the manifestation could skip a generation. So that's a variation on this story. So that's one possible example of how the theory could be extended to accord with an empirical finding of a positive coefficient for grandparents.
But the length of a generation as a time unit has been changing. Has this been taken into account? Because it has been becoming much longer, right? If you go from 20 to 40, the role of the grandparents changes completely. Shouldn't this...
Right, that's true, and also there's
of course, there's no effect on the genetics.
There's variation cross-sectionally across societies and over time within the same society. And Zheng and Ji talk about that and say, well, of course, having the grandparents in the home is much more common in rural China in the period they're looking in than it is in the United States, for example. And that comes back to the point I was trying to emphasize before that says these things should vary across time and place in ways that could be intelligible to us in terms of causal pathways. Example 2 is group effects. And that actually is the topic of Section 6 in Becker and Holmes' 1979 paper. It's all in there. It's an amazing thing. It's great. It's really great to go back to it over and over again, see how much of current discussion is anticipated. So the idea here is that various types of what George Borjas has called ethnic capital might cause the intercept in a multi-generational mobility equation, which is just the version that I copied over from the bottom of the previous slide. It might cause the intercept to be group specific. So an example that's very salient for the United States would be if racial discrimination in our country causes African American families to have a lower earnings function intercept, and there's certainly a lot of evidence consistent with that, then you follow through the math and they end up having a lower intercept in the multi-generational mobility equation as well. Now that's actually an old idea for which there is some empirical support. I think yesterday someone was citing this excellent chapter by Tom Hertz in the Bowles, Gintis, and Osborne volume, which was doing PSID intergenerational mobility regressions with attention to a contrast between whites and African Americans, found that the slope coefficients were not that different between the races, but there was a much lower intercept for the African Americans. And actually a once famous article by Otis Dudley Duncan back in 1968 had the same conclusion in a book chapter called Inheritance of Poverty or Inheritance of Race. Now, what if in the data generating process that's true, that there's variation across groups in the intercepts, but you don't actually put in the group dummies in your regression? Well, though, in effect, what you've got is an omitted variables issue where you left out the group fixed effects. And if you apply the usual omitted variables analysis, because all the ancestral variables will have positive partial correlations with the omitted fixed effects, this would be a force towards pushing all of those coefficient estimates in a positive direction. By the same token, as Becker and Holmes said in 1979, this would be a force towards slower than geometric decay in intergenerational autocorrelations that don't account for the group effects. So that's another story that could be salient in some times and places. And then we come to Magnus' point, measurement error. And of course I would. I don't think I've ever written a paper that amounted to anything that wasn't largely about measurement error in the end. So why should I today be any different? So the story here is, well, even if the grandparental coefficient is really 0, it might appear to be positive because of measurement error. And I'll just give you the simplest example that makes the point. Suppose the true process is AR1 with a 0.5 parental coefficient and 0 coefficient for the grandparents and all the previous ancestors. Then the true intergenerational autocorrelations would decline geometrically. 0.5 at first order, 0.25 at second order, 0.125 at third order, and so forth. But now, to take the simplest possible example of measurement error, suppose each generation status is measured with purely classical measurement error, and suppose the measured variation in each generation consists 80% of true variation and 20% of measurement noise. Then the attenuation factor for each measured autocorrelation would be 0.8. And apply that here, and your measured first order autocorrelation will tend to be 0.4, that is 0.8 times 0.5. Your measured second order autocorrelation will tend to be 0.2, that is 0.8 times 0.25, and the third order one will tend to be estimated at 0.1. And the point is that with this measurement error process overlaid on top of the true process for log income or whatever is being measured, the measured autocorrelations would tend to decline more slowly than geometrically. And it follows from that if you just went ahead and fit an autoregression of child status on both parental and grandparental status to fit that autocorrelation pattern, you would get a positive coefficient estimate for grandparental status, even if the truth coefficient were 0. Okay, that would be the nature of the measurement error bias. Now, of course, this is a very stylized example. I mean, presumably the measurement error in reality would be more complicated than that. But it does illustrate the possibility that even if the AR1 model were a good approximation to reality, it might look like it's bad on account of measurement error bias. And this is something that researchers in this area need to keep in mind, that need to be cautious about interpreting the results and thinking about whether what they're getting might be an artifact of measurement error.
Don't we have another sense of measurement error here? That suppose, so we always have this linear model, but suppose it's really quadratic.
Yeah, well,
so,
things
but that's
get more complicated.
Oh, but that's going to be important in this setting, right? Because that means you're basically going to have this quadratic term in the error term, and if incomes are growing over time, that's going to create zero correlation. So any sort of deviation in functional formula is going to be picked up as zero correlation, as long as income is growing.
That's a good point, and presumably things could go every which way depending on the nonlinearity. But yeah, this is something worth thinking about. I mean, obviously, it's an assumption of convenience to be working with relatively simple models that are linear, but of course the reality is more complex.
But it seems to be like a big literature on income processes, which is much more developed, which is essentially the same thing. Instead of having different generations, I see myself over time.
Sure, yeah.
And we know a lot about from that literature. We know that the measurement there is probably zero correlated. Maybe it's AR1, which makes it impossible to distinguish between which makes it very hard to find unit root in data. I mean, we know a lot about these things. I'm just curious to your take on whether it feels a bit like we're trying to reinvent stuff that people have been working on, like you, for a long time in the labor income process.
Yeah, no, you're right. There are connections in the statistics for one and the statistics for another.
Models are applicable, but most of that literature is usually within a single generation.
But how is it different? Just think about
It's just the link across generations is somewhat conceptually different, right? I'm just saying the empirical work, you just can't go to the shelf and say, okay, we find some kind of, some very nonlinear process, which is what's true in the data generating processes for individuals, but that doesn't necessarily imply the functional form on the next generation.
I think it's going to be
the generational linkage.
It's going to be even worse here, because if you have income growth, any sort of nonlinearity is going to look like zero correlation.
Well, but you could check that. I mean, it depends on the form of the nonlinearity, but you could imagine specification error tests, specification for tests, right?
Sure.
To see whether
Yeah. Anyway, the point is, well, and actually I think this was a comment Stephen made discussing what turned out to be my sociology journal paper at ASSA in San Diego is, well, what about when the process is not linear? And of course it isn't. And
I thought so. The takeaway from that literature is we need very long panel data to learn anything. With short panel data, then everything comes down to exactly how it's specified.
Yeah, well, we've kind of discussed that already. That
but now we're talking about
if we had only 2 generations, we don't really know what the 3-generation pattern would be. And that's why if we want to address that, we have to have data on more generations.
the way these averages are treated, you're averaging out over maybe some other aggregation issues, but you're averaging over multi-periods within each generation and then forming relationships across generations with those averages. That's going to tend to attenuate some measurement error within each generation, right? Unless you think there's intergenerational correlations in measurement error.
In names, in occupations, I'm sure there is, right?
I don't know. Maybe. But earnings?
Let's continue that discussion later. I want to be sure to get to my discussion of Greg Clark's work too.
Can I?
Yeah.
If this is anticipating your next point, say shush. I mean, there's another issue would simply be aggregation. What I mean by that is, suppose that I had one view, which is the ACE model, that this outcome today depends, and the only thing I care about is additivity. There's something called the genetic component plus something called a family input plus something that's idiosyncratic.
Yeah.
If those terms themselves are AR processes with different coefficients, they don't aggregate to an AR1.
All right, we already saw that with the Becker-Tomes model, that there were basically 2 AR1 processes that were interacting to produce an AR2.
But I want to, I'm pushing this a little bit differently in the sense that it's not because of the way they're doing the conditioning. This is simply a statement that in general, that if you think about mechanisms, even though each mechanism has the AR1 property, they simply, it's not generic that they would aggregate to AR1s.
Right. Yeah, that's right.
So I found a reference to this China paper interesting of looking at, you know, whether there was this co-residence or there, and that might be an appealing way to get at measurement error if you have some other variation, and you know, do you see a bigger grandparent effect where you see greater co-residence, or say in African American families where you might have them co-resident, or in this point about where the generations are closer together. Are there other papers that have exploited this in any way to sort of see if heterogeneity and grandparent effects?
I don't know of another paper
that seems like a
uses the co-residence information.
promising way to potentially separate.
Yeah, although I thought you were actually going for still another interpretation of that, which was the measurement error properties were different if more were known about the grandparents because they were still alive and living in the same household. So we can, once again, we're showing how creative we can be about multiple interpretations of the same evidence. Yeah?
Just one other data point. For the U.S., historically, down through 1940, Jason and I have now done 4 generations, and we find a 4th generation coefficient that's larger than you'd anticipate if it was just an AR1 process.
Mm-hmm.
We find it for a relatively homogeneous population, white native born.
Mm-hmm.
And we're in the process of looking at how the grandparental coefficient changes over the course of the 50 or 60 years or so at the beginning of the 20th century.
Mm-hmm.
And we're also working now on the relationship between co-residence and the grandparental coefficient in particular.
Great. Okay, so there will be more evidence on that. Excellent.
It's a living literature.
Yes, well, that turns out to be a lot of the theme. So there are there are many possible causal processes that are going on. But there's one other that I want to focus on today, which is Greg Clark's story. So as many of you know, what Greg and his collaborators have been doing is through making extraordinary efforts to gather data from many countries over many centuries on socioeconomic outcomes for individuals with rare surnames. And when they get this information, they don't actually know who's the child of whom. So they can't do micro-level intergenerational regressions. But what they do is, for any particular name, they aggregate up to a group average in say, the child's generation, and a group average in the preceding generation, which I think they define as, I don't know, 30 years earlier or something like that, and run group-level autoregressions, basically. When they do that, what they find is, what they say is a very robust result, is that the group-level correlation between adjacent generations and various socioeconomic status measures is about 0.75. And they say the decline of the autocorrelations across multiple generations is not badly approximated as a geometric decline. So they interpret these high and persistent intergenerational autocorrelations for surname group averages as reflecting the, quote, true rate of social mobility. They claim that conventional family level measures, like what I and many other folks here have estimated, are downward biased, that they give a misleading impression of mobility due to a sort of errors and variables bias, but it's different from the one I was talking about before. I was sort of saying, well, if you just have mismeasurement of education or, you know, log income or whatever, you know, you'd have an errors and variables bias. But what they're talking about is even if your education variable is perfectly measured and your income variable is perfectly measured, still any one of these measures is a noisy measure of the individual's, quote, fundamental social competence or status. So the idea is that taking any particular indicator is giving you a noisy measure of something, some deeper latent status. And then they say they fix that bias by doing the group averaging, that the measurement errors are going to tend to get averaged out if they've got, you know, 50 people with the same rare surname, and that's going to almost eliminate that errors and variables bias.
Why isn't it the same measurement error? this is just a grouping scheme they're claiming, right? By grouping the data and assuming linearity, so aggregation issues.
Well, mathematically it's the same.
It's the same.
But it's a different source of the error. Where I was sort of, you know.
It's measurement error. It's measurement
It
error.
is so.
It's
Yeah.
a grouping argument.
Yeah. So Clark concludes that an AR1 intergenerational mobility regression with a coefficient around 0.75 is, quote, a law of social mobility, unquote, applicable to all societies in all eras. And it's such a strong statement that it seems like he couldn't have said that. I must have made it up. So I have to put a direct quotation, which is saying exactly that. He says, all social mobility can essentially be reduced to one simple law, which is an AR1, and he says the persistence rate B is always high relative to conventional estimates, generally 0.7 to 0.8. So that's the basis of the quotation on my first slide from Greg that said multi-generational regression to the mean takes 300 to 450 years to play out. Where that's coming from is that the autoregressive coefficient is really high, and it's an AR1 process. It takes a lot of generations for the autocorrelations to decline close to zero. So that's interesting, isn't it? But the question is, do we really believe it? Does the evidence really accord with the story that they're telling? And to his credit, Greg does highlight some testable implications of the hypothesis. Now, one of those is that his claim should not be specific to grouping by surname. Grouping by anything should get rid of the errors and variables bias for the most part and deliver this supposedly universal coefficient of 0.75. So when I first heard about this, having been working in this area a long time, I just started kind of spinning my wheels. Say, what studies do I know about out there that were actually doing the regressions with group average data? And there are quite a few. For example, that's the standard way of looking at mobility for immigrants, because people haven't actually been able to do it at the micro level. So an example is a chapter in NBR volume by Card, DiNardo, and Estes that uses U.S. decennial censuses to estimate intergenerational regressions for years of education and log weekly earnings for immigrants grouped by the country of origin. So that should deliver 0.75 according to the Clark story, but it doesn't. It comes out about 0.45. And there's similar results in George Borjas's 1993 Joly paper. Another example is from Bosch Mazumder, where for another purpose, he was wanting to look at trends over time in intergenerational mobility in the United States. He and Dan Aronson also used decennial census data to estimate intergenerational regressions of men's log earnings, and the grouping comes in through the explanatory variable, which was the log of the average income for their parents' generation in the men's state of birth. So they're the aggregations by state of birth, and the point of the study was the estimates change over time and talk about the implied trends. But their typical estimate was about 0.45, although it varied across which decennial census and which cohorts they were looking at. And then, in a way, the most striking thing is that Nathan Hendren's work with the Chetty team, which is famously forthcoming in the QJE, turned out, I think at Larry Katz's request, to include an appendix that said, well, what if we group by surnames? What do we get with this huge, huge data set based on everybody's tax returns? And if they used all surnames, they got an estimate of 0.42. And then when they kind of replicated in spirit what Clark and collaborators were doing by restricting to rare surnames, it actually went down some to about 0.35. It's just not 0.75. So this does not look like a universal law. And not to say that you can't get 0.75. Greg and his colleagues got that in many cases, but it doesn't seem to be a universal law.
So Gary, why not just take per capita income for the entire country?
Yeah, you could do it at the country level too, I suppose. Yeah, right. The one other thing I want to highlight is another explicit prediction from Clark in EJ paper with Neil Cummins it says, well, if you created an omnibus measure of status that combined multiple indicators, then you should get your results moving in the direction of 0.75. So Kelly Voster's, the Michigan State student I mentioned earlier, has completed a very nice paper that follows that suggestion using the PSID and uses a multiple proxies method that just fits this situation like a glove due to a restat paper by Lubotsky and Wittenberg, so that after first running the usual intergenerational log income regression, then she starts supplementing her parental status measure with education and occupation measures, and not an awful lot happens. Her estimated intergenerational elasticity moves from 0.44 to 0.47 with the addition of those two other dimensions of status measurement. And it just doesn't look like it's zooming up to 0.75. So my bottom line is that when we follow up on these testable predictions of the Clark hypothesis, it doesn't accord with those tests very well. But that raises the question of if he doesn't have the right story, what is the alternative explanation? Yeah?
Can you say 2 words about how Kelly combines the indicators?
I'm not going to give a short answer, but if you look up the Lubotsky and Wittenberg paper, you'll see how it works out.
It's just a factor model.
Yeah.
Just straight factor analysis. That's it.
What the intuition is that it turns out that if you do least squares with multiple proxies, if they were all measured on the same scale, the estimated coefficient that would minimize the attenuation inconsistency would simply be the sum of the estimated coefficients. Now, in application, it gets a little more complicated because you have to do some rescaling, and that's why I can't give a really good short answer. But it's well spelled out in both the Lubotsky-Wittenberg paper and in Kelly Voster's paper. So I'm just about out of time, right?
Okay.
Yeah, let me.
According to the atomic clock, you've got a few more.
Well, let me see if I can. Yeah, see. Why don't I see if I can get through the slides, and then if time permits. Whoops. To give just to show that there could be an alternative interpretation, I want to kind of lay on you the revival of the group effect story. Except this time I'll express it in a factor model. So suppose what we have here is the log income or whatever of for family I in group G in generation T. And there are two parts, a group component and an idiosyncratic individual deviation from that. Now suppose, following a suggestion in footnote 13 of Becker and Holmes, that the group component evolves gradually over time. It follows an AR1 with a coefficient of 0.8. Sort of think of that as gradual, very gradual progress for African Americans in the United States. Suppose the individual component is AR1 with an autocorrelation of 0.3. Mush them together, and it's really just for the observed intergenerational correlations, it's just a weighted average. As a back of the envelope example, I just make up what if 60% of the variations within group and 40% between, and then it's just simple arithmetic that the first order intergenerational correlation will be 0.5, the weighted average of 0.8 and 0.3. The second order turns out to be 0.31. The third order turns out to be 0.22. The fourth order turns out to be 0.13. Totally contrived example, but notice the following points about it. First, by construction, it accords with Clark's evidence. When you average across 50 people, with a little bit of measurement error, you're just going to be replicating that AR1 process with the 0.8 coefficient. So that's what he's getting. Here's another story for getting that. At the individual level, though, the first order autocorrelation is much smaller. And unlike in Clark's interpretation, in this story, the smaller individual autocorrelations are not spuriously attenuated by errors in variables bias. They are what they are. They are the true individual level social mobility. And finally, as you saw in the previous slide, the autocorrelations were declining at a less rapid rate than geometrically it fits that pattern that we saw in some previous studies. So, of course, that doesn't prove that this is the right answer. Never mind that I made up the parameter values. But the point is that it's just that there could be multiple stories to explain the results, and we don't have to be tied to the Clark story, which is having some serious trouble fitting some of the evidence. So here's my wrap up. What do we know so far about multi-generational mobility? Obviously not nearly as much as we'd like to, but here's what I'm willing to put out there. First, some fragments of the multi-generational evidence are roughly consistent with an AR1 process. Not to say that that could possibly be exactly the true process, but might be a good approximation in sometimes in places. But other studies suggest that the coefficient of grandparental status is positive, or in other words, that the intergenerational autocorrelations decay more slowly than geometrically. Point two is where the grandparental coefficients are estimated to be positive, there are many possible sources of that, which include, among others, including some we haven't talked about or ones I haven't thought enough about, like nonlinearities. There could be direct causal effects from the grandparents, including cultural inheritance if they co-reside or live nearby, group effects, and measurement error. Thirdly, I've picked on Greg Clark some and said that the particular errors in variable story that he has told is rejected by some empirical tests that he himself suggested. And fourthly, I want to kind of end on an optimistic note and say that actually there's good news in that, because that's an example of showing that advancing our knowledge about multi-generational mobility can be achieved by looking at the evidence. So the cheery note on which I'll end is that I believe we actually do know a lot more about social mobility than we did 30 years ago. And we're continuing to make progress. In fact, Joe Fury was just giving us the example. He's got 4-generation data and more stuff to show us. So I think this is great. Yeah, great. So it's all good. We're moving ahead.
Can I ask you just a question?
Yeah, it's all right with me.
No, but I mean, so far you were talking about these grouping schemes, but it seems like implicit in some of these grouping schemes would be some kind of social interactions. So that actually what you would find is that groups actually sorting. I'm trying to put together Durloff and Shishadri yesterday with Becker and Tomes, which they didn't do and you haven't done, but it seems like a useful thing.
Well, they did
so we just get these, some, but I mean, I'm just saying spatial correlations themselves would actually lead to some kind of effects like immigrant enclaves and so forth and so on. I'm just wondering.
Well, that's part of the backstory for why would you have group effects.
Right.
The example I gave was discrimination against African Americans, but you're absolutely right that the things was really the subject of Borjas's AER paper about ethnic human capital, as he called it. Was
it's just like Wilson.
There were social interactions.
Yeah, but Wilson saying somehow because the blacks were segregated.
Yeah.
They were nonetheless exposed to a wide range of individuals in the community.
Yeah.
You had notions of role models or some other, but that itself was a positive force towards transmission. So that the Becker-Tomes model would depend not just on the parents, but the neighbors and the neighborhoods.
Right. And when you do that endowment equation, and I think they actually explicitly said this in chapter 6 of the treatise in the family, is that you put all kinds of things into it.
But the literature
other relatives, and it could be neighbors too.
But the literature hasn't done that, you're saying? So I'm just.
Well, I don't know. Wasn't Stephen doing that yesterday?
Well, he didn't show any data. Showed us some others. Maybe this time next year.
Yeah. Well, you could sort of. It's what George Borjas was trying to do.
No,
but there was
the immigrant enclave.
But there's always the possibility of what other interpretations of the pattern.
But there's no reason to think that grandparents are necessarily any more important than any of these other people that are in the parents' network.
Yeah.
Parents bring a whole
friends, neighbors.
All right, the extended family
teachers.
should be associated with certain ethnic communities, right, and a certain kind of social capital that might be inherent in that community. I'm just as an I'm just asking empirically whether people have tried to do that and explaining.
I mean,
Isolates.
The sibling correlation stuff, where the stuff you've done with
And then neighbor correlations
and
too.
others,
Yeah.
where you decompose.
Well, have they even put in things like, cousins and,
Well,
second
there's
cousins?
starting to be a literature about
Sweden,
that.
I think.
In Sweden, they've done that? Yeah. So what are the findings?
No, I don't know.
Oh, okay.
I've heard preliminary stuff.
Well, as you'd think, the cousin correlations are positive and they're smaller than the sibling correlations.
Yeah, but they're there.
They are there, yeah.
But it's the reason to
And,
care
how,
about.
and nobody knows really how much
Do they
is
knock
nature
out
and how much
grandpa?
nurture.
Is the question.
Is there any reason to care about grandparents more than these other types of effects of peers?
Yeah.
Not necessarily. First of all, obviously not in terms of the causal process. Whatever it might be, we'd want to know about. And then it does kind of go. I skipped over it fast. It kind of comes back to why do we care about multi-generational mobility at all? And I don't know. I think it's unsettling to us if we. I suppose Greg was right that if a particular family's rich in a particular generation, and suppose that. Suppose we knew for a fact that means probably the same family will still be rich 5 generations later, or feels more disturbing if we say if they're poor, they're just stuck. They're just going to be poor for generations to come.
Just going back
bothers us.
to your autoregress, I realize just in least squares you're not going to be able to identify it, but there were attempts. You mentioned Wall and some of the other literature where people are trying to use an instrument. Right, and you have a lag-dependent variable with serial correlation. That's a classic econometric problem. So with instruments, you can always question the validity. People tried to decompose that lambda from your gamma, or right. And so the question is, what were the relative estimates in the literature that tried to do that? It's a more limited literature, but I'm just curious what they find.
Well,
so one is genetics, and one is more like an income process.
Well, when they use lags as the instruments, it has the same problem we always have with using the
higher order
lags
lag.
unless the error
like
term
innovations
is serially uncorrelated, it's not a
but
valid
income
instrument.
shocks, for example. I mean, people could get transfer certain generations.
Oh, I see.
Holocaust survivors got these transfers from the German government, and on and on. There are these kinds of things that we use in the permanent income analysis.
Well, that was for part 2 and Anders' talk, right? The natural experiment.
No, but I'm just wondering when they do that, how you could separate lambda from, whether or not they do separate lambda from
I think the question is, does any of that literature have more than 2 generations of data? Off the top of my head, I'm not.
No.
Oh, I think only 2.
Yeah.
Only 2.
It would be interesting.
Okay. But
And as you said, there were kind of mixed results from the 2 generations.
3 generations.
The other literature that's slightly relevant is the one that has significant others influence. And the old Wisconsin model, you had that significant others, and their parents, their peers. So that's kind of a network effect.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thanks so
Thank
much.
you.
And, 9:15, we will